Kia ora mai tātou. When the House adjourned for the dinner break, the House was discussing the taxation bright line test for residential land bill. The question is that part one, stand part.
Yep, so David Cunliffe.
Oh, and the Honourable David Cunliffe had the call. He has 1 minute and 40 seconds remaining if he so chooses.
Of his first call.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and good evening to colleagues and to viewers. Before the break, we were reflecting upon the context for this actually very important and significant tax bill. This is the bright line test that says if you sell a property that you're not living in, minus a few exceptions, within 2 years, you pay tax on it as a trader, or at least that's the high-level plan. And before the dinner break, we were noting that that is one way into a very, very important issue for New Zealand, which is the twin catastrophe of the housing crisis that's locking young families out of the Kiwi dream, and the misallocation of investment capital, which means basically we're spending all our money bidding up each other's house prices, often through speculative investment, enslaving ourselves to the mortgage for longer, and not investing in the productive investments that will create jobs and incomes for the future. That is an absolutely central issue to the problems of the New Zealand economy, and unless we fix it, quite simply, we will be poorer in years to come and our children will have less opportunities. So now the question is, does this bill materially help? We'll answer that, sir, our colleagues and I, by quite an extensive range of calls. This is a really important and detailed bill. And let's begin by saying, what does the bill actually require? Well, it's got a 2-year bright line test from the date that a person takes title, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
That bright line test will only apply to residential land, that is to residential real estate. It does not apply to business property and it does not apply to farmland. So that is a very, very important distinction, because residential mortgages are about 53% of the total bank mortgage stock. Farm mortgages are a little over 20, and business working capital and business mortgages are about 16. So the definition excludes around about half of the mortgage stock. The bright line test, of course, doesn't apply to a person's main home. That's important, and we agree with that, because we've never thought that there should be any form of capital taxation on people's home, because it's not just an investment. The bright line test will not apply to property acquired through an inheritance. We also concur with that. When we were working on capital taxes earlier, we didn't have a disguised inheritance tax there either. Losses arising from the bright line test will be ring-fenced so that they may be only used to offset taxable gains from other land sales. That sounds good, but it's actually, as we will show later in the debate, a very broad ring-fencing provision which reduces the coverage of the bill. So what's at a high level, what are the issues with this bill? Well, let's start from how much it's going to achieve. According to the government's advisors, the Treasury and the IRD, this bill, when fully implemented, will take how much tax in a year? 5 million. $5 million for a property tax across New Zealand in a whole year? Are we kidding? What is that? 2 houses in Auckland? It is almost impossible to imagine how a number so small could have even been estimated or calculated. Upon what possible basis could $5 million have been resolved? So that is the first clue, ladies and gentlemen, that there is something deeply wrong in the design of this tax. $5 million a year. It is a tax you have when you haven't got a tax. Okay, so why is that? Well, the first thing is that, of course, if it's a 2-year test, speculators will hold for 2 years and 1 day and then sell on. Now, at the moment, 17% of property sales occur within the first 2 years, but we would expect that to change drastically with this with this bill becoming law, because people who are holding for a year and a half simply will hold for 2 years and 1 day. It is highly ineffective because it is very easy to game. Very easy. It's a massive loophole, and it just invites speculators to hold onto their property and then flick them 2 years later. A tax which only applies to sales in that arbitrary period will not deter land bankers. Now that's really important because, as Mr Twyford has often exclaimed, the government's state housing areas for the last couple of years is only a matter of a handful of homes that have actually been built. And one of the reasons for that in Auckland is because people are land banking, even in special housing areas, because with Auckland's rampant price inflation, they can be pretty sure that their investment's going to be worth more a couple of years down the track. Again, this bill will do absolutely nothing to fix that. The test has been made even weaker by Cabinet agreeing to exempt New Zealand residents from providing their IRD number when buying or selling a house. Well, that's kind of odd, because you have to provide an IRD number if you're transacting assets in or out of a trust. You need an IRD number if you're transacting assets in or out of a company, but you don't need an IRD here if you're a resident, which means that applies to people who aren't even citizens. That is a very, very odd exception for Cabinet to have agreed to, and the Minister, who is the understudy Finance Minister, I'm sure will be able to leap to her feet with alacrity and a lot of enthusiasm and explain to us why on earth they have that mile-wide exemption. The government ruled out a more comprehensive 3-year test or a 5-year period, despite Treasury early recommending it, because it could be interpreted as a capital gains tax. Well, although we don't want to use those 3 words in the same sentence, the whole point of this is to tax speculation. So if it doesn't do that effectively, Mr Chairman, then it's probably not worth having. Mr Chairman, let us ask ourselves if in the broad design, Mr Chairman, final call, Mr Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, if in the broad design this tax is so flawed from the outset that it merely nods at the problem but does nothing to solve it, then why have we got it here on the House floor? And Mr Chairman, as a colleague said before the dinner break, I think it was Mr Twyford, that is because this is national stock and trade. The government resists pressure for change to the point where the focus groups tell them it is intolerable to do nothing. Faced with that pressure, they do something. Usually, almost nothing. And that is what we have here. The only reason we're supporting this is because almost nothing is about $5 million better than absolutely nothing, which is what we had before. But almost is only almost. So, why, Mr Speaker? That, for me, this is the unsolved mystery of the bill, and the Minister may be able to explain Cabinet's rationale. Why would this government design a tax that is so useless? Who benefits? Because one thing you've got to say about the current government, you know, they may be doing the wrong things, but usually there's method in their madness. And so I want to know who it is, who are the beneficiaries. Well, I can think of some. Well, it certainly isn't Kiwi mums and dads, because they're going to be paying more for their mortgages and slave for 50 years, not 30. It sure as heck isn't Kiwi kids, because most of them will be growing up in rented homes that they can be kicked out of on a whim on a month's notice by their landlords, and swap around schools and so on and so forth, and the effects will be felt throughout their lives. It's not Kiwi kids. Is it real estate agents? Well, yes, it probably is, because this tax doesn't quell the property market, so they will be riding that bubble as they always were. They certainly aren't losers here. Is it the banks? Maybe here we're a little closer to the heart of the onion, because the banks are experiencing record profitability off the housing and property boom. If you think about it, if your family's taking out a mortgage for 50 years instead of 30, and you're paying interest for the extra 20, not you, Mr Speaker, but the average Kiwi, then it is the bank's profitability that will be lifted, particularly in a low interest rate environment as we have at the moment. So it's not Kiwi kids, it's not mums and dads, it is probably the banking system, and of course, it is the property speculators. Mr Speaker, I would invite the Minister to reassure the House that this bill was badly designed by accident rather than design, because there is a rebuttable suggestion that this is a deliberate sham that has been designed to look like the government's doing something when they know full well they're not. And the reason that they're not is because the powerful interests in the financial system and the property sector have made damn sure they won't, even though they know it would be in the interests of every Kiwi family to have a more effective piece of legislation than we are called upon to pass into law through this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, Labour MPs and our colleagues on the side of the House, we will be drilling in to this piece of legislation over this evening as we go through the committee stage. We will go through it part by part, clause by clause, comma by comma, and we will expose for New Zealand why it is not only not effective, why it cannot be as effective as it needs to be, and why that $5 million a year for the whole country is really just the cost of a PR stunt. This is a PR stunt, not real tax law. The members opposite know in their heart of hearts this is really a tax joke. They know this isn't going to make a blind damn of difference to the Auckland property bubble or anything else. All it does is let the national government off the PR hook from a rising tide of angry parents, angry householders, worried sick about meeting their mortgages or being tossed out of their rental accommodation. It is a political bill, not a substantive tax bill, despite the fact that it has taken the time of officials and select committees and this House, and we will do justice to that process. But, Mr. Chairman, there is no doubting that this bill is not an effective piece of legislation. Labour is supporting it only for the reason that we wish to send a signal that the problem to which this bill supposedly addresses itself is one of the utmost importance to the New Zealand economy and our society. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I call Poto Williams.
Thank you.